Welcome everybody. I hope you're all doing okay. I know it's an unusual time. Some of you might be working from home these days. Others might be in the lab where you're running full speed doing virus research or something else. So either way, it's not a normal time, and I'm really happy we get a chance like this to connect and to talk about some solutions that we can all benefit from either now or when life goes back to normal. I assume you are all people who work with proteins or who have worked with proteins in your labs, and you all know that proteins can be really difficult, and you all know that you need to keep your protein happy in order to get reliable and reproducible results and to get high quality research, which is of course what all of us want to do. So let's talk about that a little. How do you commonly check your protein? So I'm sure you have a bunch of methods that you use. Everybody does. The most commonly used ones are shown here. They are all really, really fundamental to life science research, so I'm sure you're all familiar with them. You've probably used some type of UV-Vis spectrophotometry, whether it's a cuvette-based instrument or something like a nanodrop, to assess the concentration of your protein, to check whether it's pure or whether there is nucleic acid contamination or something. You've probably all run SDS pages or sometimes with Western blots afterwards, which help you kind of identify your protein via its size or molecular weight. You've probably run some kind of column, gel filtration or something else to separate proteins from one another and to resolve what's really in your sample. So I'm sure you're all familiar with those methods, but I'm going to be very cheeky and ask you, do those methods really check whether your protein is happy? And I would argue that they don't, because they do check for some components, I think essential components of protein happiness. They do check for the presence of your protein, for purity, for concentration. You can check how similar your samples are, for example, from one batch to the next. But what they don't check is whether your protein is functional. And I think that that's a really important point that is not necessarily covered by the methods that people routinely use in labs. So that's why I want to show you today how you might be able to address that. And the tool that I would recommend to pretty much anybody who works with a protein is the Tycho NT.6. It can help you get data on all of those points. We've got them listed again here. Functionality, which I said is missed by many other methods. Presence of your protein, purity, similarity, concentration, all of those within one experiment. And it does this, especially the functionality part, via looking at the structural integrity or foldedness of your protein. We'll get into how it does that, of course, a little bit later, but I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. I think this is really important because it means that you can use Tycho at any step in your protein workflow. And this is true whether you are a lab that purifies their own proteins or whether you buy proteins from elsewhere or you use proteins that you get from a different lab. It doesn't really matter what context you're in, but if you use proteins at all, then there's going to be multiple steps in your workflow where Tycho can be beneficial because you don't usually assess your protein's functionality and happiness at all of those steps, but now you can. So, for example, after initial purification, you might want to check whether your protein is there at all. A little bit later, when you're purifying it, you might want to check which fraction contains your protein and already check whether it's functional at this point, because if it's not, you might as well stop and start over. Once you've got your purified protein, as I said, whether you purified it yourself or whether you bought it, you are probably going to want to check whether it's pure, whether it's functional, what the concentration is. And if you do it routinely, so if you work with the same protein over and over again, you're going to want to check if your batches are similar, because that's going to be key to getting reproducible data later on. You also might want to check different storage conditions because you want to keep your protein for a while. Of course, you don't usually use it all up in one day. So you need to check what your protein can handle and how you store it best for it to stay happy over time. And finally, this is of course what you're usually going for, some kind of analytical assay that you want to do with your protein, whether you're characterizing the protein or whether you're using it as a tool to characterize something else. You're going to want to check how you're using your protein in that assay, at what concentration, with what buffer, for example. Check whether it's still active and still functional or whether you need to do something else further upstream. So all of these, as I said, are critical points, and Tycho gives you the chance to check at each of those steps because of these points. So this is really important. Tycho is really quick. One experiment is done in 3 minutes. So this really doesn't take a lot of time. It doesn't make you wait for the result, and it doesn't stop you from going on. It does this so quickly because it uses a really unique thermoramp, so it heats up your protein really, really quick. It's also label-free, which means you don't have to prep your sample in any way. There's no other components you need to add, no buffer you have to change or anything like that. You just put your sample in and go, because it uses intrinsic protein fluorescence that's already there. And finally, it doesn't use a lot of sample at all. You use 10 microliters per sample per data point is kind of, data point is not quite the right word, but per sample, which means it's also not a big investment material-wise, and therefore, again, a great tool to use at any step. I want to show you what kind of data you can expect out of Tycho, and of course, by looking into that, I'll also explain how that the data is generated. So on the left here, you see a typical unfolding profile. That's what we call it in Tycho. And it's called that because it shows how your protein unfolds. So that's what Tycho does. It thermally unfolds your protein by heating it up, very simply. You can see on the x-axis here the temperature. So we heat your protein really, really quick. As I said, in 3 minutes the experiment is done. So the heating ramp is 30 degrees per minute, and it's really fast. And the reason why we heat it up like that is that we want to see it unfold, because that gives us a lot of information on how it's behaving and on whether it's folded in the first place, right? Because if it's not folded in the first place, it won't be able to do its job later on. Proteins need their three-dimensional structure in order to do their jobs. So we see it unfolding and we know it was folded, and we see how it unfolds, and that gives us further information. Because, for example, the temperature at which this profile curve turns around, so the inflection point of this curve is what we call inflection temperature, or TI. And this is an interesting parameter because it can help you easily compare across conditions, for example, across buffers or across proteins. It's a nice indicator of how stable the protein is overall. Of course, the signal that we get depends very much on the fluorescence of the protein. So this is what I said earlier. We use the intrinsic protein fluorescence of the tryptophan and tyrosine residues, and we plot them in a very specific way, which is called a ratio of two wavelengths that we detect. We don't have to go into all of the detail, but that's how we detect the protein itself, and that's also how we detect it unfolding as we heat it up, because the fluorescence properties of those residues change depending on where they are in the protein. So at the beginning of the experiment, while the protein is still folded, those residues are in the center of the protein and buried deep down. But once it starts unfolding, they get into contact with the buffer. And this leads to a change in fluorescence that we can see. That's pretty much all there is to it. And then the protein's unfolded and done. And these give us a few more parameters that we also can later use for comparisons. So for example, the initial ratio, the starting value of the whole experiment, but also the delta ratio, similar to what you would elsewhere maybe call the amplitude of your curve. And all of these can be used to really pinpoint what's happening with your protein. There's two more parameters that you can see here on the left that are not shown in this image. One is the sample brightness, which is really just a measure to look at protein fluorescence overall. And this can be connected to its concentration. So that's really useful for different reasons. And then finally, the profile similarity is something that Tycho can calculate for you if you are comparing two or more unfolding profiles. And this can help you determine whether your proteins are, let's say, similar enough. For example, if you're looking at a routine protein purification and you're comparing batches, you might want to have them be a certain percentage of similar each time, otherwise you want to reject it. So just a very general intro into Tycho data. Of course, we'll get into much more detail on the following slides, and you'll also get some real-life data to see. One thing that's really important when we talk about Tycho and about the experiments you do on it is that it's almost always about comparing. And I'll show you some generic examples what I mean by that. So for example, let's say, I've mentioned this earlier, maybe you're doing the same protein purification over and over. You're going to want to check whether your batches are all similar. And the way to do that is usually that you would have a reference from the past. So this is a batch you purified, let's say, half a year ago, and at the time you characterized it really well. You know it was the right concentration. You did all your analytical assays with it. Maybe you have an activity assay you can do. And you know that this was a batch that performed well and that you would want to replicate in your future purifications. So this is the gray sample shown here. This is what it looked like in a Tycho experiment. And now we have two newer batches, the green one and the blue one, that we are comparing to it. And we can easily see for batch number 1, the green one, that the general shape of the unfolding profile is the same. And the inflection is happening at a similar temperature. So there is quite a few similarities between those curves, and that's probably the right protein, and it's probably okay. But we also see a very large difference here in the initial ratio of the two batches. And this is an indication that some of the protein in batch number 1 is actually already unfolded at the start of the experiment. So that's something you definitely want to know, and it would then be up to you to decide whether that's still good enough to go or whether you might want to repurify. If we look at batch number 2, the blue one, we can see that the unfolding profile has a totally different shape. It goes in the other direction. It looks really, really different. And from my experience, I would say that that's probably a different protein, or something else went really wrong in that purification process. So you're not going to want to continue with that. You're going to want to start over, because this won't be able to give you reproducible results at all. Another type of a comparison you might want to run is looking at different storage conditions. So I've mentioned this earlier as well. Again, the gray sample that you can almost not see here is our reference. So that's the freshly purified protein before storage. And then you're going to store it certain ways, for example, at -80 degrees, shown here in green, or at 4 degrees, shown here in blue. And then you're going to compare to what it looked like before storage and see which condition impacts your protein the least, right? Because you don't want your protein to change during storage. And in this case, you can really easily see that the -80 degree storage, the green unfolding profile, is pretty much unchanged compared to the reference. So this way of storing your protein is fine. Your protein is really happy. If you look at the blue one, however, storage at 4 degrees does influence your protein somewhat, as before we get a significant difference here in the initial ratio, meaning that your protein is already partially unfolded in the sample. So out of these two alternatives, you're definitely going to choose -80 degrees for storing this protein. And as another example, I want to show you what you can do with this type of experiment when you're screening for different buffers, for example, for assay optimization or any other reason. Again, the gray line is your reference. This is your standard buffer. Maybe this is your storage buffer of your protein. And you're comparing, let's say, two different pH conditions to it. And again, you can see the green one, pH 5, it looks okay. There is still a lot of protein that's unfolding. But you can see that it's shifted slightly to the left, so it's gotten a little destabilized by the change in pH. But when you look at the pH 4 condition, the blue one, there's almost no protein left to unfold, and it looks almost all unfolded already. So again, it helps you to really quickly select buffers that are suitable for your protein to make sure you can keep it happy even during an experiment. So as I said, it really often comes down to comparing, and it's always really helpful to have a reference that you know you'd want your protein to look like. But of course, there are some other conclusions that you can also draw without comparing, and one of them is shown right here. So this is a really nice example of, this is a real life case finally. So here's the same protein shown, but two different batches. The green one, as you can see up here, this is batch number 1. This is actually the newer batch of the two, and you can see there is no unfolding. We can see almost no change in the fluorescence, so it's not a totally flat line as in horizontal, but it's not showing us any type of transition. There's none of these characteristic steps in there, right? So we can conclude this protein is already unfolded. There is nothing in there that can unfold, and therefore there is probably no functional protein in here. At the time when we ran this experiment, we also had an older batch still sitting in storage, and this is the blue one, batch number 2. And you can see this one looks perfectly fine. We get a really clear unfolding signal, a really nice delta ratio amplitude. We see a inflection point, a TI signified by this vertical line, and we know immediately this batch is fine, the other batch is not. What's interesting about this is you would usually assume that your new batch is better, right? In this case, it turned out not to be true at all. And it was especially interesting because our original plan was to run binding affinity experiments with this. So our monolith instruments that you might be familiar with, they are designed to measure binding affinities, so the strengths of interactions between molecules. And we wanted to do that with batch number 1 of this protein. And when we did that, we saw nothing. There is, again, a flat line. There is no binding signal at all, because all you get is noise, because there is no folded protein in your sample that could potentially bind anything else. But when we got that other batch out of storage and tried it with that one, we got a really nice binding curve. This is what it should look like. And you can immediately see that it's helpful to know what's on the left before you even start to your downstream assay on the right. If we hadn't had this Tycho data, we would have probably tried with this batch number 1. We would have tried it in the monolith experiment. We would have tried to optimize the assay and get it working, but there is no chance we could have succeeded. So this is information that's really, really good to have early on. Another type of experiment that you can run, or another type of comparing samples that you can do on Tycho, is a thermal shift assay. You might be familiar with this concept. There's other instruments or methods out there that help you run a thermal shift assay. The cool thing about Tycho is, of course, that it's quicker. So if you look on the left, the concept is illustrated. Again, you have a reference. This is your protein by itself. And then if you add a ligand to it that binds the protein, it will usually stabilize the protein and therefore shift its unfolding profile to the right. So this is what we can see here, and this is why it's called a thermal shift assay. These are done in different contexts for different reasons. So for example, sometimes in drug discovery contexts, you might want to run a whole library of small molecule compounds against a target protein in order to find small molecules that bind to your target protein. So this is one way you can do it. One way you can use a thermal shift assay. But another that is more commonly done on Tycho is what we call a functionality test, because this, again, helps you understand whether your protein is functional. If it binds its ligand that you know it should be binding, if it binds its ligand, then it's probably folded correctly and probably also ready to do all its other jobs. So this is a really great test you can run if you have a protein that, for example, uses a cofactor that you know, if it binds ATP or something, you can test this again during your purification or after storage, or at whichever time point you need to know whether your protein is still functional. Another context I want to talk about is SPR workflows. So this is an example. Of course, this same principle applies to other types of assays, but I think SPR is very good to illustrate the benefits here. So SPR, of course, surface plasmon resonance, is a technology you would also run for looking at interactions. It gives you affinity data, it gives you kinetics data, and it's a really well-established method, obviously. So a lot of people do this, and there is a bunch of steps in the workflow where Tycho can help you. So the workflow is shown here. From left to right, you have to immobilize your protein on the chip of the SPR instrument. So that's always the first step you have to do. And then you have one or several interesting molecules that you want to test their interaction with your target protein, and those you would let flow across your chip and see whether there is an interaction or not. Between those steps, there's always equilibrations and washing steps and stuff, and at the end you would then really validate interesting candidates you found and deeply characterize them. So let's go back to this earlier step of immobilizing your protein on the chip surface. As I said, this is integral to the process. If you can't immobilize your protein, you can't run your SPR assay. So this is really important. What Tycho can help you do at this step is check whether this protein is actually still okay. in all the different ways we talked about. It can help you check whether your protein is tolerant against DMSO, because that's a component that's often included in the buffer of those interesting molecules that you want to investigate. And finally, you can use Tycho to check what buffer you are best to use for immobilizing your protein. Further downstream then, you might be running a whole bunch of interesting molecules in what's called a screening campaign. So a quick campaign to have single dose data just to see what's binding, and then later you would go on to really characterize how strong things are binding and so on. But in the screening campaign, you might want to even do a pre-screen on Tycho via this thermal shift assay that we talked about. You might use Tycho to identify the ligand concentrations that will actually give you a signal, so that you don't waste material. And finally, you can also use Tycho to look at the quality of those interesting molecules in case they are proteins. So again, checking for protein happiness before you actually run your assay. So all of these are very good places to use Tycho. I want to show you two specific examples, one about immobilizing your protein and one about screening. So this immobilization of your protein on the chip is typically done at low pH for reasons that are intrinsic to the system, because the low pH simply helps get that molecule in close contact with the surface that you want to mobilize it on. So you really need to go as low as you can. What's not always done is people don't always test whether those low pH conditions are actually potentially harmful to the protein. And the only reason they don't always do that is because it takes a lot of time. It's a pain. And I totally understand that. So what people often do is they immobilize the protein on the chip with a really low pH buffer. Then they go further downstream in the process, and then they really start running their binding experiments. And then if there's nothing binding, then they start wondering, maybe something happened to my protein, but you can't know for sure. So I think it's a lot better to really do this early on, use Tycho to check those different pH conditions and see what they do to your protein. So in this data that you can see here, again, we have a gray sample, that's our reference. This is our protein in its, let's say, storage buffer. We're looking here at a kinase, P38, that is very often used in these types of experiments. And then in addition to this storage buffer conditions, we have tested 4 different pHs. You can see them down here from pH 4 to pH 5.5. And you can see for the orange and the purple condition, those are the 2 lowest ones, lowest pH values. We can already see again there is nothing left in the sample to unfold. The protein is already unfolded at the beginning. So we know those are buffers that really destroy your protein pretty much. And if you use those to immobilize the protein, you will have immobilized, unfolded protein, which is probably not going to work in your binding assay. So instead of those, you would probably want to use either the blue condition or the green condition, pH is 5 or 5.5, that somewhat destabilize your protein, as you can see by the shift of the unfolding profile to the left, but they keep a lot of it still in the folded condition. So that's definitely a much better choice for you to go, even if maybe you can't immobilize quite as much in those conditions as you could in the others. Now this is the second step that I want to talk about, the pre-screen. And this is data from a customer in Switzerland. And again, here on the left is quickly shown what he does. So he screens for potential binders on Tycho using this thermal shift assay concept that I explained earlier. Anything that looks positive, he selects, and only those candidates he then uses to perform an SPR experiment and really characterize them. On the right here, you can see a table of some of the components he tested. He tested a bunch more. That's just a selection. And he ranked them by the shift in TI that they showed on Tycho. So you can see some of them showed a really large shift by more than 15 degrees. Others showed a really small one. But those are just some of those that showed, and he was able to rank them really nicely. What's nice about this is that actually he later characterized the affinities too, and the affinities correlated with the shift in TI. This is not always the case, but in his case, it worked out really nicely and it really helped him understand what's happening. What I also want to mention is that before this customer had a Tycho, he used to use a method called thermofluor, which is also a pretty commonly used method to do those thermal shift assays. It's set up a little bit differently. You need to use a die. You do it in a plate format. So it is a bit different, but it gives you the same type of information. And his conclusion was simply that Tycho gives you better data and it gives it to you quicker and it uses less material doing it. So he switched over to using Tycho completely for these purposes. So just to come back to the SPR workflow, these were just 2 out of many examples that we could potentially talk about where Tycho can help you optimize this workflow, make sure you don't waste time on steps that shouldn't take a lot of time, and make sure that you're not spending time on, for example, on conditions that can't work for you anyways. And as I said, of course, this whole concept is not just true for SPR. We already looked at a monolith experiment earlier on. Whatever type of analytical assay you want to perform, it's always going to help to check for these things early. Now, one thing I've mentioned in passing earlier is that Tycho can also help you analyze your protein's concentration, and it does that via fluorescence. And because that's special, I want to spend a little more time on it, because this is not something people commonly know about. It's not something that's routinely taught, at least not in the school I went to. It's unusual, but it works. And it works in some ways that are really different from how the other methods out there work. And that's why I want to talk about it a little bit. Again, it's a lot about comparing. So what we do is we look at the protein's total fluorescence signal. We call it the brightness of the protein. And if we compare the brightness between samples, that can tell us about concentration. This can help you immensely because it's done anyways. Any Tycho measurement that you run records this data anyway. So you've got the data there. You don't have to make up your mind whether that's a thing worth doing, but the data is already there. What's important is that it works especially well for low concentrations, which are concentrations that are hard to analyze by many other methods out there. The method is buffer independent in a way that is also complementary to other methods out there. For example, I've talked to a customer who uses this for his protein purification because he purifies his protein with a flag tag. And this flag tag interferes with his nanodrop measurement. So he can't use regular absorption measurements at this point, and he's really happy he can use Tycho to get an idea of how concentrated his protein is. Also, the limitation of this, and I don't want to pretend it doesn't have limitations, is that your reference and your unknown sample need to be the same protein in the same buffer. And you always need something to compare to. If you don't have anything to compare, you can't really know what's going on. So this is important, but as I said, it's complementary to many other methods out there, and you've got the data anyway, so why not use it? The way it's done is really simple. You have your known concentration sample that you know the concentration of, and Tycho measures the brightness of, and then you simply draw a line through that sample and the origin, and from the brightness of your unknown concentration sample, you can then conclude its concentration. So that's a really easy type of calculation, right? This is nothing new at all. It's just new to do it in this context. Okay, so now we've talked about Tycho itself. We've talked about the kinds of experiments you can run on it. We've seen some examples and some data. I want to introduce you to a totally different topic, which is kind of an extension of Tycho itself, and it's called Tycho Cloud. The reason I want to talk to you about it is because this is a really cool project we're working on. This is the first step we are taking towards realizing a really, really big dream that we have. And this dream is about a data-driven and interconnected future, by which I mean that we think we have got the technical capabilities to start really inventing these systems that help you store your data, manage your data, share your data, wherever you are, especially if you're, for example, working from home, or if you're collaborating with people in other countries or other places in the world. We need systems that help us really understand all of that data that's already out there. There are so many databases, for example, with structural information on proteins, with sequence information, and so on. But it's so much data that it's become really hard for individual people to make sense of that data, and we need to harness artificial intelligence and other digital methods to really understand that data and connect those insights across databases, across technologies. We also think we're in a place where we can build software that can really help you understand your results, know what to do next, suggest what to do next, present your data in ways that are really beneficial and maybe creative, and also a place that helps you monitor your equipment, check whether you've got consumables left, check whether you need servicing or repair or anything like that. So bits and pieces of this are already around, but not so much in the life sciences. So we're hoping to be able to build something like that. And Tycho Cloud is our first step in that direction. And we're hoping that maybe some of you guys can come on board and help us realize this dream. So more specifically, Tycho Cloud right now is a cloud-based online data management and analysis software for Tycho. It's in the beta stage, which means it's not finished. We are still working on it, we're still testing it, but the reason why it's already out and accessible to everybody is because we want to understand what you guys need, what the researcher needs in a software like this. So if you are curious, go and check it out and let us know what you think. I do want to show you briefly what it's capable of doing at this time. So one example is it can really help you manage your data online, your Tycho data, of course. You can upload your data there either manually, so experiment by experiment, or you can even hook up your Tycho to the cloud directly and it synchronizes everything that it does up there. You then get a table that looks somewhat like this, where you can annotate your data in many, many categories. You can sort and filter however you want, so you really get a better way of looking at your data and organizing it and not losing track. Tycho Cloud also offers analysis apps for different workflows. So here's some examples. I don't want to go into all of them except for two that I want to highlight. One is what we call Tycho binding check, because this comes back to the thermal shift assay that we talked about earlier. You saw in the example that I showed, it was really simple, right? We saw a shift of the unfolding profile towards a higher temperature, and that's a signal for an interaction. It's always that clear, especially if we are talking about protein-protein interaction, which are commonly analyzed by thermal shift assay because they are difficult to analyze by thermal shift assay. What we've done is we've trained our algorithms to understand this type of data and get you information on that and tell you, yes, your two proteins are interacting, or no, they are not, in a really easy and automated way. So that's something that exemplifies, I think, how these types of systems and apps and stuff can help you in ways that you didn't think they might be able to. Another one that I want to highlight is the concentration determination app. This is, let's say, somewhat less special, but still really convenient. Because we talked about concentration determination via fluorescence, there is a little calculation that you have to do. It's not a very difficult calculation, but it's the type where you wouldn't want to make a mistake. So also for that, there's a really convenient app there that calculates it for you, plots it for you, and gives you a report at the end. So these are the types of things you can do with Tycho Cloud at this time, and we're planning to add more and more apps in the future, depending on really what you need. So to sum up about Tycho, I just want to really emphasize how it's about the happiness of your proteins and how you need to focus on that because it'll save you so much trouble elsewhere. Tycho can help you quickly identify the quality of any protein sample in just 3 minutes. So it's fast and it uses only microliters of material. As I mentioned before, it can test for the presence of your protein, for purity, for similarity, functionality, and concentration, and that's all in one experiment. It's labor-free and buffer-independent. You don't have to prep your sample or do anything else with it. And it can help you make any of your protein workflows more efficient, whether we are talking about purification, characterization, anything else. And I do want to point you towards this because this is a new way of getting Tycho. So if you're interested, the best way to get Tycho is to subscribe. So we now offer subscriptions in addition to regular purchases. The reasons why this might be interesting for you is this is the quickest way to get a Tycho, and you can decide how long you want to keep it. You've got recurring costs, monthly costs, which means those are of course much lower than an investment into a purchase. There's no hidden fees, there is no surprises, and it's really predictable how much it will cost you over time. We've got different plans available, so you can choose between flexibility or security depending on what's more important to you. And of course, you can cancel very easily, just send us an email. So if you're interested in that, there's more information on our website that you can see here. You don't have to worry about copying down the link because once we're done with the webinar and you log out of it, you will be taken to that page anyways. So finally, I just want to leave you with a quote from one of our customers. This is Dr. Stefan Gajewski from Nurix, and he says that he puts every protein in Tycho first. He says the data is very reproducible in his hands. You just mix your samples, you put the capillaries in, and 3 minutes later you have your results. It's the only equipment I would recommend to anyone working on proteins because there are no downsides in having a Tycho. So in other words, Tycho makes Stefan happy, and I hope it can do the same for you. So with that, I want to close. I want to thank you very much for coming and joining us today in this webinar. Please stay healthy and safe and connected. If any questions come up later, feel free to contact us, but of course we'll take some questions now. Thanks a lot.